Welcome to our online lecture about online identities. Let's jump right in. Now, I think it's important to ground our conversation about online identities in the traditional theories of identity. Now, identity has been studied across a wide variety of different scholarly areas, so I'll have you look to the additional resource I provided for the references for this specific topic. But I think it's important to talk about identity looking at the variety of different ways that people have studied identity in the past and some salient issues to online identity. So let's start out by talking about it. Biologically, Shore talked about identity being related to who we are in terms of our genes. We might look at identity in a more trait-based way. I think that's what we usually do as lay people. Who are you? Oh, I am fun, I am sexy, I am a female. These things make up who I am. Erikson looked at identity by emphasizing the importance of childhood, whereas Cooley looked at identity looking at the ways that other people relate to us and how that impacts how we see ourselves. Constructivists like Lingle and Golub look at identity as being constructed by cultural norms, whereas Karba argued that identity then creates cultural norms. You can look at it like Tajfal and Turner did when they're looking at how group memberships impact identity, or you can look at it in a more philosophical way like Wittgenstein did by looking at the way that sameness and differentness impacts identity. You can look at it like Beck did, or Sakamoto, or Middle, looking at the material embodiments identity. The show Dollhouse or the movie What Dreams May Come is a really interesting conception of the materiality of identity. You can look at it like Langelier did when you're looking at the narratives and the stories we tell create and recreate who we are, or more specifically within narrative, like how Schwartz and Haluga talked about how location-based narratives talk about who we are and connect our identities to specific places. You can talk about it like Goffman did with performance, or you can focus on a combination of different things like Hecht did when he created the communication theory of identity. Is your head spinning just a little bit right now? It probably is, because that's what it's like to study identity. There's so many ways to conceptualize it. But then there's other issues that I think we need to think about as we're talking about an online identity more specifically. Specifically, I think it's important we talk about the idea of a conscious identity that we perform versus an unconscious identity. Now, Jung considered these different, and that your actual identity was the real unconscious identity, as opposed to the one that you just perform. Clark talked about having identities that are imposed on us by individuals or other systems. You've got the idea of Goffman's aspect of control, how much how much control do you have over your identity? You've got scholars that will talk about permanence of identity. Mischel talked about that personality is a more stable trait, whereas McNeill and Fleeson, in a more postmodern way, talked about that personality is expressed more temporally and dependent on context. You've got some scholars like Giddens who talk about having a core sense of self, whereas Turkel or Gergen talk about having a fragmented self and how that can be good or bad. And you've also got Higgins, who will talk about having an ideal sense of self, a certain set of qualities that you strive to possess. So these are different things to conceptualize when we're thinking about identity and ways we can think about identity. But I think it's important then to look at it specifically online. And I think that what we need to do that, just to preface, is to look at a history of online social networking. Digital Trends provided a history of social networking sites, and so we're going to look through some of that. Now, in the early 90s, online communication was characterized by text-based communication, chat rooms, personal websites, blogs, etc. And that was no more exemplified than in anything but in 1997 when AOL Instant Messenger came out. In the early 2000s, we saw a movement towards visual-based internet communication with Friendster, LinkedIn, MySpace, WordPress, and Facebook. As we continued on through the early 2000s, we started to see additional social media sites popping up. And in addition to that, we saw the rise of the smartphone. The iPhone that was released in 2006 brought that online self more intimately connected to the offline self because it's integrated into our everyday life. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen that there's additional major social networking sites that have been coming out. And what we can see in looking at this history is that we've moved from a more anonymous sense of self to an unanonymous sense of self to a more anonymous sense of self. So an anonymous sense of self means that we can be disconnected between our online self and our offline self. In the 1990s, Turkel talked about how the internet provides an incredible opportunity for an identity workshop or playground. Because it's a text-based environment, we can control who we appear to be online. I can be black, female, and in a wheelchair, but I can portray myself to be a rich white male online. And you can't tell me that that's not who I am because it was anonymous and text-based. You have no other way to go off of except for what I tell you. Today, we've moved to a more anonymous sense of self online, which then means that the online and offline selves are more connected. And that starts to impact the ways that we might be doing things like self-presentation online. Self-presentation online is obviously impacted by the visual-based sense of communication. Katzek and Herring talked about the way that profiles impact the way that we see ourselves and others see us. In addition to that, we need to think about the content that we share, even the text-based content, because that starts to impact the way people see us. Do we share an embarrassing story or a story that makes us look better? Do we share our locations? Because the locations then start to paint a picture of who we are and where we are. We can also look at, like Van Dijk did, the structures in social networking sites that limit who we might be or who we are allowed to be. So in a history of social networking sites, Van Dijk noted that social networking sites moved from building communities to monetizing communities, which meant shifting from trait-based to more narrative-based conceptions of identity, such as when the timeline became required by Facebook. And Lingle connected to this idea of what Van Dijk was talking about when Lingle talked about how Brooklyn drag queens led an activist movement to fight against Facebook's rules about only having one online profile. Facebook is able to make money based on people having an authentic sense of self, an authentic presentation of self online. If it's not authentic, people can't mine it for data about how to sell things better to us. So Facebook is trying to get us to have that more authentic sense of self, and that's policed in part by the structures that are there. Now, in addition to having these limited structures online, we also have collapsed audiences that are limiting who we can be, imposing on the identities that we might have online. Weinstein noted that we have collapsed audiences, so our performances aren't just for grandma or just for our boss, like in on our offline life. They are all together in one single place. And yes, we can monitor our privacy settings, but if you've noticed, privacy settings have changed greatly over the course of time, and it's sometimes hard to monitor what those privacy settings might be. In addition to the collapsed audiences and the limits we have, another thing we need to think about with our online identities is that we have an archived history of ourselves online. So what that means is, like Kurmeyer, Rakil, and Rahimini talked about, online selves have this trail that people can follow in a very easy way. It's easily located, easily searchable, and it's in one place. We do have offline trails, but it's not as easy as in social networking sites. And in addition to that, we have prolonged relationships with people. So their view of who we were 10 years ago when they knew us might be different than who we are today, but that never changed for them. So to them, we are the same person, and that may impact the way that they present with us online. So inherently, our online selves are connected to our offline selves, which means that there is this push for this authenticity online. And connecting that to our the way that we construct our online selves then is that we need to think about it. Yes, we have an editable and retractable sense of self online. If somebody says something we don't like about us, we can just delete it or we can edit it. But what that means is, because we have this pull towards the authentic sense of self, we're tied to who we are offline. If you are in a wheelchair, you will be presenting yourself as on a wheelchair online, or someone will find out and you will lose those connections that you have. It is a performance-based space. It is visually focused. And so that starts to impact some sense of self as well. We don't control our online spaces. We don't control our offline spaces either, but we are actively existing in a place that exists for money creation and money earning. So even though we'd like to think that we control them, like this activist movement by the Brooklyn drag queens, we don't get to actually control it because it is someone else's business. And this archived sense of self means that others can, we can create this essentially essential version of ourselves that's idealized, but other people can put this on us as well. And as we're looking at this archived sense of self, I mean, we can connect it to things like our offline record. So when I was 16, I got a speeding ticket, but after 7 years, that speeding ticket was taken off my record. A criminal record, we've noted when we think about it reflexively that it shouldn't be something that follows us around. But our online identities do follow us around, and people can look back and think, okay, that impacts who they are today. Yes, it does, but it's maybe not the exact person that they were today. So there's a few things that you can conceptualize in here and think about as you're putting together your online identities. What I would like you to do is I'd like you to try to find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Right now, I'm actively participating in all of these social networking sites, at least on a weekly basis. I'd love for you to see, as of 2015, this is who Julie Walker was online, and you can compare it to how you know me and see if you see those online connections being the same today or connecting in the way that you know me today as I did back in 2015. Thanks for listening.